comics seems to have waned as well. Now, that might be because academics were far more interested in a more pervasive medium of television, which was taking hold in America's households, or it might be that because people tended to stop reading at 14 or 15, academics didn't really give it much credence or attention because people seemed to drift away from it quite naturally. In any event, there really wasn't much there to study, and so people simply didn't study it. Now, there was some academic research in the ensuing decades, but it was rare. That, of course, has all changed in the 21st century, as your gracious invitation would suggest is possible. So, I'm here today to tell you, to ask you to consider, to invite you to think about the importance of comics. Comics are a medium that are worthy of study, that are in need of study, and that are open to the contributions of faculty and students alike. Now, I'd like to start my presentation by talking a little bit about a rationale for studying comics. I think I need to give you some good reasons if you're going to accept my argument at all. So let me come up with 3 reasons why I think that comics are worthy of your time and attention as a topic of study. Then let me tell you a little bit about the different approaches that I've seen colleagues across the country and around the world take in the pursuit of understanding comics. What have they done to really study comics? What are some of the methods they have used to make sense out of the messages that are embodied in comics form? And then finally, let me introduce you to some of the venues where comics scholarship can take place. Once you've done the kind of work that I'm advocating here, where can it find a life? Where can it find presentation? And there are a surprising number of venues that are specialized for comic studies that are both taking hold and growing at increasing rates, surprising rates, delightful rates in my estimation. So let's begin by examining just why it is that comics are worthy of academic study. First of all, I would submit to you that comics are a storytelling medium. The 1950s campaign against comics and the subsequent marginalization of the industry as juvenilia cemented a perception in the public's mind that comics were ephemeral, disposable, and beneath the effort to reflect on them in any kind of rigorous fashion. But like other storytelling media, this is just not so. There is significance to all the ways in which we tell one another stories. For example, fairy tales might be offered to children just as comics are. But folklorists will confirm that the stories that are told through fairy tales are meant to bond both listener and teller in a desired social contract, and that lessons about the consequences for misbehavior are there to reinforce stringent and expected social norms. You might note that since the Grimm brothers taught us about trying to put children into ovens, that witches have radically decreased the number of attempts they have made on children cooking. So this seems to be working to some degree. Because music is enjoyable, just like comics are enjoyable, we do not discount that the lyrics to our national anthems, our religious hymns, our Christmas carols, or our pop songs don't have deeper meaning for the groups that sing and enjoy them. We understand and accept there must be significance to these things because we tell ourselves them, we sing them to ourselves time and time again. We may read the products of journalists for information, but we cannot discount that the stories that those gatekeepers choose to tell us are reflections of social priorities. Else, who would care about the romantic entanglements of Hollywood actors? In like manner, educated minds should be none too quick to dismiss comics as powerful storytellers. Consider, for instance, the analysis that Tim Blackmore published in the International Journal of Comic Art. In it, he analyzes Frank Miller's graphic novel 300, which was later adapted into a popular film by Zack Snyder. Blackmore uses the form of rhetorical criticism known as mythic criticism to argue that the themes and symbols found in 300 are used to reinforce cultural values. In the case of this work, we are retold the story of King Leonidas of Sparta, who leads 300 of his soldiers to fend off the invading Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. That's a historical fact. But the graphic novel exaggerates to some considerable degree. It presents Leonidas as a larger-than-life figure. It presents some of the villains as monstrously deformed. And it plays liberty with the historical odds, putting the Spartan army against the invading Persians. But that's not really the point. It's not meant to be an historically accurate presentation. It's meant to tell the story of how society, who values freedom, must sometimes stand and make sacrifices for the perpetuation of that freedom. That's the story that Frank Miller wanted to tell. That's the story that 300 attempts to communicate. Comics are not only powerful storytellers, but they are also interesting litmus tests of our history. Comics are a mirror, oftentimes, to the issues that culture is struggling with at any given point in time. And so, a second reason for their study is that comics have historical impact. Like other forms of storytelling, they mirror those issues that are relevant in their times. Now, the interesting thing is, because there was so little scholarship done in the latter half of the 20th century into comics, there's really a great deal of work to be done in looking at how comics were embodying social issues in their period. One example of this takes place in the works of Joe Dorowski, who teaches at Brigham Young University in Idaho. He's created a whole series of books called The Ages of, insert a character's name here. And I've written a couple of pieces for Joe, most recently in The Ages of Wonder Woman. In the essay that I contributed, I examined the changing roles that Wonder Woman played in her alter ego. While her colleagues, Superman and Batman, have had relatively stable positions in their alter egos, Wonder Woman has repeatedly changed vocations. Now, as Clark Kent, Superman is consistently portrayed as a journalist, and Bruce Wayne, as Batman, is consistently a playboy philanthropist. But the case of Wonder Woman is different. Although most often an agent of the state, her role changes over time. What's particularly telling about this dilemma is that for most of her career, Wonder Woman has been written by male authors. These men seem to struggle to find a role for a woman that produces interesting story vehicles. Take, for example, the case of Diana's role as a NASA astronaut trainee. Now, that sounds like a pretty cool job to me. I would think that as a NASA trainee, there would be lots to do. And yet, in the course of storytelling in the 1970s, Wonder Woman stayed a NASA trainee for all of 12 months, and then found another job. As a reflection of the times, I think this saga reflects the conflicted notions of how men are trying, in the late 70s, to process what it means to have female coworkers take on positions that have been historically inhabited by men. There's tons of examples like that in comics, where as a reflection of their times, we can better understand them by studying them with the methods that the Academy makes available to us. The third reason I think that comics are worth your time and attention is their potential as an art form. Harvey Pekar was a file clerk who chronicled his mundane life in Cleveland, Ohio. In a series of comics he called American Splendor. Harvey made several astute observations about the world, some of which were carried on to the late night show with David Letterman, and in a feature film also called American Splendor. But his most astute observation really came when he talked about his chosen mode for communication, comics. He said, comics are words and pictures. You can do anything with words and pictures. Harvey's idea is something that we see many gifted storytellers practicing. Perhaps none so much as talented as Art Spiegelman. Art Spiegelman is the author of Mouse, which is probably the most lauded graphic novel of all time. Quick show of hands, who has read Mouse in this room? I know where the faithful are seated now. This is good. Good. Well, this is good, because we now have to convince the rest of the room to read Mouse. Mouse tells two parallel stories. One is the story of Ladek, a Holocaust survivor, and a tale of how he survived that horrific experience by use of his wits and sheer will. It's also the story of Art, his son, who, not a Holocaust survivor himself, must try to make sense of the Holocaust as a second-generation survivor. And so he must process his mother's suicide, his father's OCD, and his own survivor's guilt. But it's not just another Holocaust narrative. Mouse is a biography and a memoir told in comics form. And not just any comics form, but channeling a particular genre of comic storytelling called funny animals. It's the same genre that gave rise to Pogo Possum in the comics and Donald Duck in animation. And it's a tradition that stretches all the way back to ancient Greece and Aesop's fables. But to speak of a Holocaust in such a medium, what is one to think of such an exercise? I think of art. Spiegelman grew up voraciously consuming comics art, including funny animal comics. To him, it was as natural to process the world in terms of comics as some of you might process the world in terms of music lyrics. Anyone out there have a soundtrack for their workout? Yeah, I see the heads bobbing. I know you do. Spiegelman dared to share his sense-making through his artistic voice. He expressed his inner workings as unorthodox as they might seem to some, and in doing so helped many people who have read the graphic novel access the complexities of the Holocaust like no one before or since. Art. And so in sum, comics are a storytelling medium, a mirror of history, and an art form. It is certainly the preoccupation, if not the duty, of the Academy to explore and explain such phenomena. But how? In the second edition of The Power of Comics, Randy Duncan, Paul Levitz, and I talk about three approaches to research: the descriptive, the interpretive, and the critical. Each one of these approaches offers opportunities for us to explore comics and the meanings within them. Let's start with descriptive approaches. Descriptive approaches seek to explain the social world. Why do people behave in certain ways or react to certain stimuli in the ways that they do? Descriptive research seeks to provide explanations to such questions. Typically, answers are discovered through formal processes of either observing the behavior in action or by collecting reports of attitudes and experiences through carefully administered surveys. Descriptive research has shown us the value of reading comics. We know that comics can be particularly helpful in assisting people with literacy skills. Previous research has shown that comics are proven to motivate readers, to enhance reading skills, and to assist in second language acquisition. For example, George Malia reported on students involved in an experiment where different groups were asked to read a historical text. One group got a text-only version. A second group got the text with illustrations. A third group got a comics version of the material. After each group read the material, they were tested for their recollection, comprehension, and their knowledge of the history lesson itself. One of these did not fare well. Which one do you think did not fare well? The first one, that's right. Statistical analysis of the results showed that students recalled the content of the comic as well as the text with illustrations. Those who read the text-only treatment fared the poorest in the comparison. Malia concludes that comics are at least as effective as the other two options as teaching tools. Now, descriptive approaches aren't just limited to the kind of work that Malia has done. There's certainly other kinds of work out there. For example, there's a work going on with Neil Cohn, a cognitive psychologist who investigates how the brain processes comics messages. There's also the work of James Kaklios, whose The Physics of Superheroes applies understanding of science to the stories in comic books. Indeed, there's a whole world awaiting enterprising social and physical scientists to investigate the meaning that comes out of comics. But the opportunities for studies in comics stretch across the academy and into the camp of the interpretivist, too. Interpretive methods are particularly useful for looking at the messages within the characters, the stories, and the artwork itself. Accordingly, scholars who employ interpretive methods pay close attention to the content of the comics and attempt to explain what the messages in the comics mean by making specific arguments about the significance of what they are saying to us. Now, one interpretive method, among many, is something called content analysis. Researchers who use content analysis are interested in patterns of meaning that appear in mediated messages. To them, they're interested in counting the number of times a particular portrayal, or particular event, or particular saying occurs within the media. Thus, they are looking at frequency to try and make sense out of how much the media values certain ideas. By quantifying their discoveries, researchers compare and contrast the data in profound ways. Now, one example of this comes from Russell W. Belk, who reported the findings of his research in the Journal of Consumer Research. He's a professor of business administration, and what he set out to do was to investigate how it was that America reflected its preoccupation with material possessions in comics. And so he asked the question, are the wealthy portrayed positively, or are they treated ambiguously or even negatively in the comics? In order to answer that, he conducted a content analysis of 5 comic book characters who were associated with their wealth. And so he looked at the miserly Uncle Scrooge from Donald Duck comics, the heiress Veronica Lodge from Archie, funny animal adversaries the fox and the crow, and the world's richest boy, Richie Rich. Belk found a number of interesting portrayals among the individual characters from his analysis, and was able to conclude that the comic books taught lessons consistent with accepted values about wealth. Namely, that wealth should be earned honestly and used responsibly, and that those who did not follow this model suffered misfortune accordingly. For example, while Uncle Scrooge might not be the most generous duck in Duckburg, he certainly is someone who earned his money through hard work. And in repeated stories, he recounts how he earned his fabulous wealth. In contrast, his adversaries, the burglaring Beagle Boys, have their schemes to swindle his fortune away foiled each and every time. Because of the extent of his sample, which covered several decades and characters from different publishers, Belk's thoroughness sustains the strength of his claims he makes about the portrayals and understanding of wealth representations in popular culture. The interpretive school includes both quantitative methods like content analysis, but also qualitative methods like those of close textual reading. This welcomes in a wide swath of the humanities, including literature, history, and art, among many others. Take, for example, the work of Charles Hatfield, whose Hand of Fire has become the definitive biography and analysis of the life of Jack Kirby, the co-creator of the Marvel Universe. Or Jodorowsky's series that I mentioned to you earlier, looking again at the historical messaging going on in the comics form. Whereas the interpretive methods lay bare deeper meanings in comic texts, critical methods pay particular attention to exposing imbalances in social power and advocate for change. The principal subject of analysis in such methods has to do with ideology. Ideology refers to a set of sense-making ideas about how the world works. Ideologies aren't hidden, unless they can be considered to be hiding in plain sight, as they are composed of the taken for granted assumptions about the way the social world is supposed to work. One of the most familiar imbalances in power that critical scholars seek to expose is the power dynamics between men and women. Now, comics have a history of being male-dominated, both from the creator side and from the subject side. And even when men are present, they are often stereotyped. Even comics that do not necessarily cast women as sex objects are still apt to define women's roles as secondary. In a classic study of the ideological implications of the popular British comic book series, Jackie, researcher Angela McRobbie found that young women were consistently being subjected to an agenda that stressed traditional sex roles. Stories dealt with preparation for a domestic role in marriage, notions of idealized romance, and devotion to fashion and beauty. The problem with this, as McRobbie explains, and I quote, "Girls are being invited to join a closed sorority of shared feminine values which actively excludes other possible values." So, in other words, the comics magazine's message foreclosed rather than opened possibilities. Rather than clearly suggesting that happiness followed becoming a homemaker, and not even mentioning the possibility of becoming, say, a physician or a college professor. Consequently, the closure focused young women on adopting values that serve the dominant group in society, the men who happen to own Jackie magazine. Now, let's not lay this at the feet of our British compatriots, because American comics don't fare any better than that. Some of the most prominent and enduring female icons to be published in American comics represented comparably limited career choices. And so you have a plethora of actresses, nurses, and models who populate the American comics scene in the 20th century. Even those women who do have serious careers, like DC Comics' intrepid reporter Lois Lane, are often featured in stories that really focus on romantic entanglements. Critical work not only challenges our notions of sexuality, but every other demographic, from race and class to nationality and political persuasion. Work like Sheena Howard and Ronald Jackson's Black Comics, which won the Eisner Award for Scholarly Works last year, helps interrogate how disadvantaged groups struggle with and against power imbalances. So as you can see, there's a lot of work being done across approaches, across disciplines, and the opportunities are not limited to those that I already cited here today. You can contribute too. But where, you may ask? So there are a plethora of venues that you can pursue comic scholarship within. For example, you will find opportunities in academic conferences, publications in scholarly journals and books, participation in learned societies, and public exhibitions. Now, certainly, some of the most dynamic conversations that are taking place in academic conferences. The Comic Arts Conference, which began in 1992, gets larger every year. It's focused exclusively on comics, and it's held at Comic-Con International in San Diego, California. The International Comic Arts Forum started in 1995 and regularly convenes to talk about comics. The University of Florida has hosted an annual conference on graphic novels since 2002, and in fact is holding its annual conference this weekend. There are also emerging some very specific, what I would call boutique conferences as well. There's one called Graphic Medicine, which is an annual conference that looks at the interaction between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. The conference welcomes academics, healthcare providers, authors, artists, and fans of comics and medicine. Comics are also the subject of specialties in larger, more established academic conferences. The Modern Language Association sponsors a comic and graphic narratives discussion section with numerous panels at its conference every year. And of course, the Popular Culture Association and its regionals have long hosted comics and comics art areas programming for decades. In addition to such regularly scheduled conferences, a number of special programs are arising with increasing regularity as well. Princeton University is hosting a special 2-day conference, again, this weekend, called Frames, Jewish Culture and the Comic Book. Something about this time in April that brings out the comic scholars, I guess. The conversation about comics is also taking firmer position in the shape of English language scholarly journals. In 1999, John Lent of Temple University launched the longest running of these with the International Journal of Comic Art. In recent years, this effort has been joined by peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics from Routledge, Studies in Comics from Intellect Books, and European Comic Art from Bergdahl. One of the, another way they're sort of coming into their own is also by the construction of online series as well, including Image Text, which started back in 2005, and the Comics Grid, which began in 2011. In addition to that, there are also numerous book series that are beginning to be published. The University Press of Mississippi was the first English language press to sponsor a series and continues to have an impressive and expanding catalog. I actually brought the catalog with me. If anyone wants to see it after I talk, I'll be glad to pass it around so you can see the 60-some books they have in their catalog now. It's really an impressive collection. But others, recognizing the success that Mississippi has enjoyed, have joined the bandwagon. And so Ohio State University Press has launched a series. RIT Press has come out with a series. The University of Texas is starting up a series. And my writing partner, Randy Duncan, and I have just taken on a series for Routledge as well. Our series is specializing in looking at particular scholarship that is from a communication theory, rhetorical theory, and media studies perspective. We're also very interested in bringing in scholarship that has been published in other countries, in other languages, that has not yet received English translations. And so beginning to import much of the work that's being done around the world so that an English-speaking audience can recognize it as well. There's even an emerging comic studies society, a learned society that will seek to unite and promote comics as an area of academic inquiry. The society was founded last October at Ohio State University at the Billy Island Cartoon Research Library and Museum, and it's currently taking steps to incorporate and begin to build a membership structure. So if you're interested, you could be one of the charter members of the society when it comes into fruition later this year. And finally, there are public exhibitions of scholarly knowledge. Increasingly, comic scholars are called on to comment on comics-related matters as media commentators, guest speakers in classrooms, and on some rare occasions as keynote speakers at academic conferences. In sum, there is no short supply of venues where comic scholarship might find a home within and beyond the academy. Let me conclude the formal part of this with just a little story. About 10 years ago, I offered a course called Seminar in Media Research. And I told the students who were interested in signing up for the class that the point of the class was going to be to help me write the first textbook in comic studies. And so what I needed from the students was help in identifying and tracking down the extant scholarship on comics. That was a reasonable goal 10 years ago. Not so reasonable today. But 10 years ago, what my students and I were able to do was identify what had been published to that point. That research helped inform the contribution that I made to the first edition of The Power of Comics. And I very happily acknowledged the students in that text for their contribution, for their help in getting me started on that path, getting that project started. That textbook is now in its second edition, and I think that's a bellwether to where comic studies are going. Faculty are interested in teaching it. Students are interested in learning it. And if I've done the work that I set out to do here today, then hopefully I've convinced you that it's a bold new day for the study of comics in the academy. There's a broadening understanding of comics as a medium for human expression, and not just as a genre, but a place where talented people are working and talented intellectuals can begin to have conversations about the nature of that work. As I noted here today, there are good reasons to study comics. There are good methods for studying them that span the academy, and there are good venues for the exchange of ideas that result from their discoveries. The challenge before you, then, is to seize upon that opportunity and pursue scholarship into comics for your own. I thank you for hearing my formal presentation, and now I would love to have questions and discussion with you.